What if your loudest moments are the ones that gave them power? What if reacting over and over is exactly how they control you? They never had to raise their voice because you always raised yours. If you've ever found yourself arguing with someone who stayed calm just to watch you unravel, if you felt crazy trying to prove a point to someone who barely blinked, or if you've tried everything to be heard and only got silence in return, then listen carefully. This might be about you or someone you know, and if it is, you need to understand. This is more common than it seems and more dangerous than it looks. Because this isn't about the noise. It's about the imbalance beneath it. It's not just about who speaks. It's about who holds the room without saying a word. Nietzsche warned us, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." But what if the monster is not loud? What if it's still? What if it lets you fight yourself while it listens, quietly, and wins? You think you're standing up for yourself, but what if you're performing? What if you're not resisting oppression, you're reacting to bait? And what if the power you think you're reclaiming is exactly what they calculated you'd lose? Let's begin, not with answers, but with the silence you've been avoiding, and the voice that only wakes up once you stop trying to be understood. There's a room, not a prison, not a battlefield, just a room. The kind that appears in dreams, too familiar to escape, too quiet to trust. In this room, there are no arguments, no raised voices, no accusations. Just you and them, and a silence so thick it starts to sound like judgment. There's a table. They sit across from you, hands folded, posture calm, eyes heavy with stillness. You speak, you explain, you justify. You open your chest and pour your thoughts out like fire. And still, they don't move. Their silence doesn't comfort. It doesn't invite. It doesn't even reject. It just watches. Like a wall that chooses not to echo. You think, maybe if I explain it better. Maybe if I show how much I care. Maybe if I raise my voice just enough to be heard. But this is not a conversation. It's a ritual, a psychic trap. They don't need to overpower you. They just let you burn alone. Every time you raise your voice, the room becomes yours, but in the worst way. Your fire lights it. Your pain warms it. Your desperation feeds it. And them? They remain cool, unaffected, untouched. That's the power of emotional distance disguised as maturity. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And that's what's happening here. But it's not their soul they're avoiding, it's yours. Because to acknowledge your emotion would mean taking part in the truth it carries. So, instead, they leave you in that room, with your voice bouncing off the walls, as they collect the image they've already carved of you. Unstable, emotional, overreactive. But here's what you haven't seen yet. That room isn't real. It's a mirror. You're not trapped there. You were taught to sit there, to wait, to beg, to ignite yourself, hoping they'd feel the heat. But they never will. Because they built that room with walls that only reflect you back to yourself. The moment you stop speaking, something strange happens. The room starts to flicker. The table fades. Their shape becomes blurred. because they were only ever solid as long as you kept performing. So ask yourself, what happens to a room built on your reactivity when you finally go silent? Does it collapse, or does it follow you? You thought you were defending yourself, but really, you were unraveling for them. Every time you spoke, you thought you were building clarity, but you were handing them bricks, and they were quietly building the box you'd burn inside. Because when someone doesn't want to understand you, your words don't free you. They trap you. They become evidence, not of what you meant, but of how easy you are to provoke. There's a cost to being the one who always explains. You become predictable. You become available. You become easy to dismantle, not by counter-argument, but by silence. You felt this, haven't you? The way your passion is turned against you? The way they say you're too much after they've done everything possible to stir too much out of you? The way they call your pain dramatic because you didn't suffer quietly enough? It's a system, not of logic, of control. They don't want truth. They want dominance, but the kind that looks like absence. They want you dancing alone, thinking you're in a duet. And this is the part you never saw. You helped them, not because you're weak, but because you were trained. Trained to prove your worth, to explain your motives, to apologize before they even accused. Somewhere, you learned that love is something you must win, that presence is something you must justify, that silence means you've failed. But that was a lie, a beautiful, brutal lie. Schopenhauer wrote, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone." And maybe that's why silence scares you so much. Because when no one answers back, you start to wonder who you are when you're not being reacted to, when you're not explaining, not defending, not performing for someone's attention, just existing. That's the terrifying thing about quiet. It puts you face to face with you. And you've been busy escaping that meeting. Because as long as you're explaining yourself to someone else, you don't have to listen to what your own silence is saying. But here's the brutal symmetry. They learned you. They studied the frequency of your triggers, the shape of your guilt, the choreography of your breakdowns. And now, they only have to stand still, and you'll move for both of you. You're not in conversation. You're in choreography, one they designed and you've been rehearsing for years. Let me ask you something. What does it mean to be too sensitive in a world that profits from your numbness? What does it mean to be too emotional when your silence is the only thing that truly scares them? You weren't loud because you wanted control. You were loud because you didn't want to disappear. And that's the cruel paradox. You disappeared anyway, not physically, but emotionally. Because every time you tried to explain yourself to someone who refused to hear you, you erased yourself a little more, until the only thing left was the fire, the scream, the noise. And they called that your identity. They called your exhaustion personality. They called your anxiety neediness. They called your boundaries overreaction. And you started to believe them, because no one ever told you that silence could be a boundary too, that calm could be violent, that stillness could be cruel. You always thought power looked like voice, that strength was about expression, that clarity came from volume. But now you're starting to see. Power can look like a calm face. Strength can sound like silence. And clarity sometimes arrives when you finally shut up. Not because your truth doesn't matter, but because they were never worthy of hearing it. There's always a moment. Not loud, not cinematic, no door slamming, no final word. Just a shift. A tiny, almost imperceptible moment when your body knew before your mind did. This is no longer safe. Not dangerous in the obvious sense, but in that quiet, corrosive way that makes you abandon yourself while staying. You didn't leave, not because you didn't see it, but because you kept hoping that maybe if you loved harder, waited longer, explained clearer, they'd finally meet you in the middle. But that middle didn't exist. It was a moving point, a mirage placed just far enough to keep you running in place. And while you were spinning in your own desperation, they stayed still, collecting your words like data, letting you wear yourself out until exhaustion looked like surrender. Nietzsche warned us, whoever despises himself still respects himself as one who despises. That's the hidden poison of this dance. You begin to see yourself through their stillness. You start to believe that your chaos is proof you're flawed, that your reactions are why they won't open up, that your need for clarity is an emotional burden they shouldn't have to carry. So you do what they never asked but silently demanded. You shrink, you numb, you mold yourself into something tolerable. And the worst part? They don't even notice, because they weren't rejecting you to begin with. They were rejecting the idea of ever truly meeting you. There's a moment you didn't leave, and you should have, but you stayed because you mistook self-abandonment for commitment. You called it patience. You called it maturity. You called it love. But it was silence. A silence that wasn't chosen, it was forced. Because speaking made you the villain, and staying quiet made you invisible. And between those two, you chose to vanish. But it wasn't noble. It wasn't selfless. It was fear. Fear of becoming the one who walks away. Fear of what they might say when you do. Fear of being blamed for the collapse you didn't cause, but kept trying to hold together with explanations and tears. Let's be honest now. You knew. Not in your mind, in your gut. That moment when their face didn't flinch, but your chest caved in. When they said nothing, and it meant everything. When you screamed, not to hurt, but to be seen, and they turned away, like your pain was a performance they'd already watched before. That was the moment. Not when they left, not when the words were said, but when you finally realized they were never in the room with you to begin with. Just a body, just a gaze, just a silence designed to make you implode so they never had to get their hands dirty. So here you are, still burning, still explaining, even in your silence, still wondering why you can't forget a conversation that was never really had. And maybe it's time to ask, what would happen if you stopped speaking, not out of surrender, but out of sovereignty? What if your silence wasn't absence, but an announcement? Not, I give up, but I've seen enough. Because maybe the most powerful thing you'll ever say to someone like this is said by the space you leave behind. There was no dramatic exit, no last word, no monologue, just a breath. Not heavy, not broken, but clear. That was the day you finally understood. You didn't need to explain, because anyone who required proof of your pain was never going to carry it with care. It didn't come like a revelation. It came like the absence of one. A quiet morning, a familiar conversation, and you not answering. Not out of spite, not out of coldness, but because something inside you had finally grown too still to keep playing the role. You were always taught that silence means defeat, that not defending yourself means guilt. But now you see it for what it is, a form of exit, not from the room, but from the game. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And maybe that's what your silence did. It wasn't passive, it wasn't accidental. It was the moment your unconscious caught up with your voice and said, "Enough." Not loudly, not with rage, just enough. You weren't giving up. You were withdrawing permission. Permission to be misunderstood. Permission to be manipulated by stillness. Permission to keep proving your humanity to someone who weaponized your very effort to connect. That silence, it wasn't empty. It was full of clarity, full of the words you would have wasted, full of the dignity that had gone missing while you tried to earn something that should have been given freely. And here's the strangest part. The moment you stopped trying, they noticed. Not because they missed you, but because they lost the mirror they used to reflect their control back to themselves. You became unreadable, unpredictable, whole. Because your quiet wasn't surrender. It was the end of performance. And now they had no script to play off of. There's a silence that screams, but there's another silence that heals. Not because it erases the pain, but because it stops adding to it. You're not loud anymore, not because you've lost your fire, but because you finally realized some people only hear you when you vanish. And even then, what they hear is the echo of a presence they never truly honored when it was alive. They whisper, you scream, and somehow they had already won. But not anymore, because you stopped screaming, and not out of defeat, but out of revelation. They didn't win because they were powerful. They won because they convinced you that your fire meant chaos, that your volume meant weakness, that your pain made you unworthy of peace. But now you see it, clearly, silently. The whisper wasn't wisdom, it was evasion. The stillness wasn't strength, it was manipulation. The control they held was not over truth, but over your reaction to their absence. And the moment you stopped performing, the moment you gave them nothing to respond to, they didn't become stronger, they became exposed. Because now there's no sound to hide behind. You're not louder, you're not quieter, you're sovereign. You're not trying to win the room, because now you understand it was never worth standing in to begin with. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And maybe that begins not with discovery, but with de-participation. Choosing not to be used, not to be provoked, not to explain, just to be, without the echo of someone else's silence defining your presence. So now what? Now that you've reclaimed your stillness, now that your quiet is no longer a void but a boundary, now that their whispers can no longer bait you into unraveling, what remains? Only this. If you are no longer reacting to them, what are you finally free to respond to within yourself? Because in the end, power was never about them, and neither was your pain. You were always the room. They just made you believe you were the noise.